The Soviet soldier crouched in the shadow of a crumbling mud brick compound somewhere in the Panjshir Valley, his hands working methodically over a battered aluminum pot balanced on a portable gas burner. Inside the pot, dozens of brass cartridges rattled and clinked as the water began to simmer. To any observer unfamiliar with the brutal realities of the Soviet-Afghan War, the scene would have appeared absurd, almost comical. But for the men of the limited contingent of Soviet forces in Afghanistan, this ritual of boiling ammunition had become as essential to survival as cleaning their weapons or rationing their water. The practice emerged not from military doctrine or official orders handed down from Moscow, but from hard-won experience, purchased with Soviet blood on the unforgiving terrain of Afghanistan between 1979 and 1989. Understanding why Soviet soldiers boiled their ammunition requires understanding the catastrophic supply chain failures, environmental extremes, and bureaucratic incompetence that characterized the Soviet military intervention in Afghanistan from its very beginning. When Soviet forces crossed the Amu Darya River on Christmas Eve of 1979, they entered a country that would expose every structural weakness in the Soviet military-industrial complex. The initial invasion force of approximately 80,000 troops was equipped for a conventional European conflict, not for counterinsurgency warfare in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. The ammunition they carried had been manufactured in facilities across the Soviet Union, from the Tula arms plant to factories in the Urals, stored in depots designed for the climate of Eastern Europe, and transported through a logistics network that had never been tested under such conditions. The ammunition itself tells a significant part of this story. Soviet small arms cartridges, particularly the 7.62 by 39 mm round used in the AK-47 and AKM rifles, and the 5.45 by 39 mm round introduced with the AK-74 in 1974, were manufactured to specifications that assumed proper storage and handling. The cartridges consisted of a brass or steel case, a primer compound, propellant powder, and the projectile itself. Each component was vulnerable to environmental degradation in ways that Soviet military planners had catastrophically underestimated. The primers, containing shock-sensitive chemical compounds, could deteriorate when exposed to extreme temperature fluctuations. The propellant, typically nitrocellulose-based powder, could absorb moisture or break down chemically under sustained heat. The brass casings themselves could corrode, and the sealant used to waterproof the primer and bullet could fail. Afghanistan presented an environment that attacked ammunition from every angle. The country's geography encompasses some of the most extreme terrain and climate variations on the planet. Soviet forces operated from the scorching deserts of the south, where summer temperatures regularly exceeded 50 degrees Celsius, to the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush, where winter temperatures plummeted to -30 degrees or lower. The daily temperature variation could span 40 degrees. Humidity levels fluctuated wildly between the arid lowlands and the occasional monsoon rains. Dust was omnipresent, a fine talcum-like powder that infiltrated every seal, every container, every supposedly protected space. This dust was not merely an inconvenience, but an active agent of mechanical destruction, working its way into the microscopic gaps between cartridge components. The Soviet logistics system, already strained by the demands of maintaining a massive military presence thousands of kilometers from major industrial centers, proved woefully inadequate to protect ammunition from these conditions. Ammunition was transported to Afghanistan primarily through a limited number of routes, most critically through the Salang Tunnel, a 3-kilometer passage through the Hindu Kush, completed in 1964, that connected northern Afghanistan to Kabul. The tunnel, already operating beyond its designed capacity, became a choke point where supplies accumulated in makeshift storage areas with no climate control. Ammunition that had been manufactured and initially stored in the controlled environments of Soviet depots found itself sitting in metal containers under the Afghan sun, baking for weeks or months before distribution to forward operating bases. At the tactical level, Soviet soldiers carried their ammunition in conditions that would horrify any ordnance specialist. The standard chest rig and belt pouches offered minimal protection from the elements. Soldiers on patrol or manning remote outposts had no climate-controlled storage. Their ammunition sat in pouches soaked with sweat, covered in dust, exposed to the full force of the Afghan climate. The magazines themselves, whether the 30-round curved magazines of the AK-47 or the newer plastic magazines of the AK-74, were not hermetically sealed. Dust infiltrated, moisture from condensation or rain penetrated, the ammunition degraded. The consequences manifested in the most dangerous possible moment: combat. Soviet soldiers began experiencing malfunctions at rates that exceeded anything in their training or previous experience. Failure to fire malfunctions, where the firing pin struck the primer but no ignition occurred, became disturbingly common. Failure to extract, where the spent casing remained stuck in the chamber, turned into a life-threatening emergency when Mujahideen fighters were advancing on your position. Failure to eject meant precious seconds lost in combat. Even more dangerous were hang fires, where the primer ignited, but with a delayed reaction, creating unpredictable timing that could result in a weapon discharging while a soldier was attempting to clear what he thought was a dud round. These malfunctions killed Soviet soldiers. In the spring of 1982, a motor rifle company conducting a sweep operation in Kunar province came under ambush from Mujahideen positions in the surrounding hills. Multiple soldiers reported their weapons failing to fire or jamming after only a few rounds. The company took 37 casualties, including 9 dead. In an engagement that should have been manageable given Soviet superiority in firepower. The after-action report, classified at the time but later revealed in post-Soviet archives, attributed the casualties directly to ammunition failures and weapon malfunctions caused by contaminated cartridges. This was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern that repeated across Afghanistan throughout the war. Soviet soldiers, facing this reality, began developing field-expedient solutions. The practice of boiling ammunition emerged from the collective experience of troops who recognized that their survival depended on addressing the ammunition problem themselves, since the official supply system had failed them. The logic behind boiling was straightforward, and, within the constraints of their situation, remarkably sound. Boiling water reaches 100 degrees Celsius at sea level, somewhat lower at altitude, but hot enough to serve multiple functions simultaneously. The heat would drive out moisture that had penetrated the cartridge seals. The boiling action would help dislodge dust and debris from the cartridge surface and from the small gap between the bullet and the case mouth. The process would also reveal defective rounds, as cartridges with compromised seals would sometimes leak propellant or show other signs of damage during boiling. The procedure became standardized through informal transmission of knowledge among units. Soldiers would fill a metal container with water, often using empty ammunition cans or cooking pots, and bring it to a rolling boil. They would then add their cartridges, typically 1 to 3 magazines worth at a time, and boil them for anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes. After boiling, the cartridges would be removed and laid out to dry completely, often in the sun or near a heat source. Once dry, soldiers would sometimes apply a light coating of oil to prevent corrosion, though this had to be done carefully to avoid contaminating the primer. The cleaned cartridges would then be reloaded into magazines. This practice spread through the Soviet forces in Afghanistan, not through official channels, but through the informal networks that sustained soldiers in the field. Veterans returning from their tours would brief incoming replacements. Soldiers would write letters home, describing the technique, and these letters, read by young men awaiting their own deployment, became part of the collective knowledge base. Officers, initially skeptical or unaware of the practice, came to tacitly approve or even encourage it after witnessing the improvement in weapon reliability. By the mid-1980s, boiling ammunition had become so widespread that it was effectively standard procedure in many units, despite never appearing in any official Soviet military manual or directive. The effectiveness of this field expedient solution was real but limited. Boiling could address certain problems, particularly surface contamination and moisture infiltration, but it could not repair ammunition that had been fundamentally degraded by improper storage or manufacturing defects. Soldiers reported that freshly boiled ammunition performed noticeably better than ammunition used straight from contaminated magazines, with significantly reduced malfunction rates. However, the process was time-consuming, required resources that were not always available, and could not be performed in all tactical situations. A unit in sustained contact with the enemy could not pause to boil ammunition. Soldiers on patrol carried what they had, boiled or not. The ammunition problem also reflected deeper systemic issues within the Soviet military and industrial system. The manufacturing quality of Soviet ammunition, while generally adequate for conventional warfare under controlled conditions, showed significant variation. Quality control at ammunition plants was inconsistent, with production quotas often prioritized over rigorous inspection. Ammunition produced in the late 1970s and early 1980s, during a period of economic stagnation in the Soviet Union, sometimes exhibited defects that would only manifest under the stress of Afghan conditions. Primers with inconsistent chemical composition, propellant powder with inadequate moisture resistance, sealants that failed under temperature extremes, all these manufacturing shortcomings had been masked by the controlled storage conditions in European depots, but became critical failures in Afghanistan. The Soviet military command structure proved remarkably slow to address these problems systematically. Reports from field commanders documenting ammunition failures climbed the chain of command, but often stalled at intermediate levels where officers were reluctant to acknowledge problems that might reflect poorly on their leadership or on the Soviet military system as a whole. The culture of the Soviet military, with its emphasis on discipline and adherence to doctrine, struggled to incorporate lessons learned from irregular warfare. Innovations that emerged from the soldiers themselves, like boiling ammunition, were viewed with suspicion by some officers as evidence of poor discipline rather than practical adaptation to circumstances. When the Soviet High Command did eventually acknowledge the ammunition reliability problem, their solutions were inadequate to the scale of the challenge. Some units received ammunition in sealed tins with improved moisture barriers, but this improved packaging arrived years into the war and never reached all troops. Directives were issued emphasizing proper ammunition storage and handling, but these directives could not change the fundamental reality that Soviet forces in Afghanistan lacked the infrastructure for proper climate-controlled storage at forward positions. The gap between official doctrine and battlefield reality remained vast. The experience of Soviet soldiers boiling their ammunition also illuminates the broader failure of the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. The war, initially conceived by the Soviet leadership as a limited operation to stabilize a friendly communist government, metastasized into a 9-year quagmire that consumed enormous resources and cost approximately 15,000 Soviet lives, with another 50,000 wounded. The ammunition problem was a microcosm of the larger strategic failure. Soviet forces were equipped, trained and organized for a war they were not fighting, against an enemy they did not understand, in an environment they had not adequately prepared for, supported by a logistics system that could not meet their needs. The Mujahideen, fighting with a hodgepodge of weapons, ranging from World War II-era rifles to modern arms supplied through Pakistan by the United States and Saudi Arabia, did not face the same ammunition reliability problems because their logistics functioned differently. Mujahideen fighters typically carried smaller quantities of ammunition, stored it in simpler conditions, and operated from bases where they could inspect and maintain their supplies more effectively than Soviet forces dispersed across hundreds of outposts. The asymmetry was telling. The superpower, with its advanced military-industrial complex, struggled with basic ammunition reliability, while the irregular forces they fought maintained functional weapons with far fewer resources. For the individual Soviet soldier, boiling ammunition became a ritual that embodied both practical necessity and psychological coping. The act of boiling cartridges was something concrete a soldier could do to increase his chances of survival in a war where so much felt beyond his control. It was a small assertion of agency in a situation defined by helplessness, a way to fight back against the bureaucratic incompetence and systemic failures that had put him in Afghanistan with degraded equipment. Veterans of the war, interviewed decades later, often remembered boiling ammunition with a mixture of dark humor and bitterness, recognizing it as emblematic of the absurdity and tragedy of their experience. The technical knowledge gained from the Afghan experience did eventually influence Soviet and later Russian military practices. Post-war analysis of ammunition performance in Afghanistan led to improvements in cartridge sealing, better specifications for propellant moisture resistance, and revised guidelines for ammunition storage in extreme environments. The Russian military that emerged from the collapse of the Soviet Union inherited these lessons, though whether they were fully implemented given the chaos of the 1990s remains questionable. The practice of boiling ammunition itself faded as manufacturing improved and as the Russian military, much reduced in size, could better control its logistics, but the memory persisted in military culture. The story of Soviet soldiers boiling their ammunition in Afghanistan is ultimately a story about the distance between military planning and military reality, between the assumptions of peacetime logistics and the brutal improvisations of war. It reveals how soldiers, when let down by the systems meant to support them, will innovate and adapt using whatever means available. It demonstrates how environmental factors, often underestimated in military planning, can fundamentally alter the character of a conflict. And it serves as a reminder that even the most basic military function, the reliable operation of small arms, depends on a complex chain of manufacturing, logistics, and maintenance that can fail in ways that cost lives. The Soviet-Afghan War ended in February 1989, when the last Soviet forces withdrew across the Friendship Bridge into Uzbekistan, leaving behind a devastated country and a legacy of failure that contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union itself less than 3 years later. The soldiers who had boiled their ammunition in the mountains and deserts of Afghanistan returned home to a society that had little interest in hearing about their experiences and a government that would soon cease to exist. Their field-expedient solutions, born of necessity and desperation, stood as testament to the resourcefulness of soldiers abandoned by a system that had sent them to fight a war it could not win, with equipment it could not properly maintain. In the end, no amount of boiling could cleanse the ammunition of the deeper contamination. The flawed strategy, the institutional incompetence, and the human cost of a superpower's imperial overreach in the mountains of Central Asia